What's wrong with our nation's prisons? They're overcrowded, often violent, and does the punishment meet the crime? There's much to talk about reform. And this morning, we'll hear from 3 men who did time, 2 unjustly, who will share their thoughts about fixing a broken system. Plus, a look back at the AIDS epidemic as a new memorial is dedicated to the lives it claimed.
This is the Emmy Award-winning 11 News Close-Up with your host, Marvin Scott.
Good morning, everyone. The statistics show that the United States imprisons more people than any other country in the world. The numbers, they're staggering. In less than 30 years, the U.S. penal population has gone from 300,000 to the current 2.25 million. Many blame the mass incarceration phenomenon on sentences that are too harsh for nonviolent drug crimes. There are lots of problems, and there is a definite need for reform. This morning's guests, they know firsthand about the horrors of prison life. They spent years behind bars, and now in their freedom, they've become advocates for change in the penal system. Glenn Martin spent 6 years in New York State prisons after he was arrested for armed robbery. And now, since his freedom 15 years ago, he has been a strong voice for the voiceless. He founded Just Leadership USA. That's a nonprofit organization dedicated to cutting the correctional population in half by 2030. Jeffrey Deskovic was wrongfully convicted of murder and rape, and after 16 years in prison, DNA evidence set him free. Jeffrey founded the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice, and he is fighting wrongful convictions. Derek Hamilton was found guilty of committing a murder back in 1991. His cries of innocence fell on deaf ears until 20 years later when a key witness recanted damning testimony and he gained his freedom. Before we go to our discussion, let's take a look back at his story. James Ford has the details.
Had it not been from him, I would still be convicted.
Derek Hamilton, who spent 20 years in prison, speaks from very personal experience about what Brooklyn District Attorney Kenneth Thompson did for him and 20 people like him, and counting. They had all been convicted of crimes they didn't commit and were exonerated with the help of Thompson, but not without having spent some 400 years total in prison for no good reason.
Look at the case and let's get down to the bottom line. Is he innocent? Is he guilty? Was his constitutional rights violated? That happened in my case, and I was exonerated because of Ken Thompson.
When Thompson won election as the first black Brooklyn DA ever, he set up the Conviction Review Unit, lawyers who analyzed convictions by Thompson's predecessor, Charles Hines, to see if injustice was done, as said via Skype by the founder of the Innocence Project, which has helped 344 imprisoned people prove their innocence. Thompson was an innovator.
He really established the way that conviction review, or conviction integrity as we call it, should be done. The best practices that Ken put forward, I think, are going to be adopted all across the country.
And our thanks to James Ford for that report. Gentlemen, what is wrong with the system? How can this be? 21 people just in the past few years from the Brooklyn DA's office have been set free because they were wrongfully convicted. How could this happen in this day and age?
You know, we have a criminal justice system where about 4.5 decades ago, we started implementing mandatory minimums. And mandatory minimums means that you take the power away from the judge to set sentences and really hand the power over to prosecutors. And I can't think of anyone in the court situation that is more inclined to want to lock people up, right? Like DAs, their entire professional incentives are around how much time you get people. So you have a system that is on autopilot where its measure of success is all about how many people you find guilty and how long you lock them up. So why would we be surprised that we've gone from 300,000 people in prison in the late 70s, early 80s to 2.25 million today?
Now, Derek, you were one of those who was really convicted based on the investigation by a detective out in Brooklyn, and you're like about 5 cases in which he was involved in. The former detective Louis Casella.
Well, 9 people have been exonerated so far based on his illegal activities and arresting the wrong person. They're investigating 100 of his cases. Scarcella was able to arrest people based on no evidence. He was able to make false confessions. He was able to tell witnesses who identified the wrong suspect. There's no checks and balances of police officers. He admitted on the stand that he had no supervisor, that he can go to crime scenes and do whatever he wanted to do. So that's a problem. There's no checks and balances. We got rogue cops that want to make arrests because there's pressure, political pressure from the mayor on major crimes. So you arrest anybody to close the case.
So Marvin, I want to add that, springboarding off of what Derek said, we need a commission on prosecutor conduct, which would be an oversight board for prosecutors. But we also need to address systemic issues. We need to videotape interrogations. We need better identification procedures. We need to have a corroboration requirement when it comes to informants. Nobody should be convicted based only on an informant without some other piece of evidence.
Now, what they're doing in Brooklyn has now become a model for many other cities where they're reviewing these cases. No one should have to sit behind bars the way the two of you did for so many years before finally being exonerated.
Well, it's being, Ken Thompson's unit is being considered by other entities, but I also want to stipulate that there hasn't been any other entities that have actually implemented what he's done. It's just on the idea stage still.
With the limited amount of time we have, let's try and get the most out of this. And let's turn to you, Glenn, because I know you've been very vocal and you have met personally with President Obama, who has commuted sentences and pardoned many people because he believes that prisons are overcrowded and some of these punishments are too harsh.
President Obama commuted the sentences of over 1,000 people in the federal criminal justice system, more than the last 9 presidents combined. Why? Because he recognized that it's within his power to correct the unjust criminal justice system that we're discussing today. But that's just a drop in the bucket. I mean, even when you look at the 2.25 million people in prison on any given day, let's take jails, for instance. On any given day, there's 646,000 people in jail, but there's 11,000 admissions each year. And we can easily lose sight of the tremendous amount of human beings that are churning through our criminal justice system. And punishment doesn't end when people exit jail. I mean, we have the scarlet letter of a criminal record, which means that people are punished for the rest of their lives. 70 million Americans have a criminal record on file.
Jeffrey, how do we change it?
I think that we need to do sentencing restructuring. There's a lot of nonviolent offenders that are incarcerated, including people over-sentenced under drug laws. Many rehabilitated prisoners are denied parole. We have way too many elderly people in prison. As a society, we've come to rely on incarceration as the answer for everything, and we can see the effects. The prison population's exploded, and the costs are out of control.
Well, Derek, I mean, you would attest to this, that there's disproportionateness in the criminal justice system that targets minorities.
Absolutely. I mean, the Almanac would tell you that. There's a lot more whites arrested and a lot more less convicted. I mean, when you go before a court, you have nobody that look like you. I mean, you're standing in front of a court with people that has preconceived prejudices about who you are. They told me for 20 years I was a drug dealer. I never sold drugs in my life. So these lies are passed from prosecutors to judges, and judges feel like they have a public safety obligation to remove a bad guy. If nobody's speaking for me saying, hey, this is not a bad guy, I'm going to jail because they believe that I'm bad, not because there's evidence to it. And Jeff spoke about 3 things that we need to codify in New York. We need confessions. We need suspects to be recorded from the time that they're arrested and the time that they leave the precinct. So if there's a question about whether there's a false confession or not, we have the videotape. We talk about erroneous identification, the leading cause of erroneous identification in New York. There hasn't been any codification on what they call sequential blind identification lineup, where the cop don't know who the suspect is. And thirdly, juries should be charged that if an informant in jail says, I committed a crime, they should be told to look at that person's testimony with close scrutiny.
Quickly,
I'm glad Derek brought it back to New York, because we have a new president coming in, President Trump, who says he cares about things like overspending in government. Right here in New York City, we have Rikers Island, where we're spending $209,000 per bed per year, one of the most progressive, resource-rich cities in the country, with Mayor de Blasio suggesting that he's this national progressive.
Should Rikers be shut down?
Rikers should absolutely be shut down.
And where do you house?
We have smaller jails in the boroughs now. We have 2,200 people already in the boroughs, 8,000 at Rikers. When I was at Rikers, there were 23,000 people there. We've already cut the population by more than half, but the budget has doubled in the same time. We have to shut it down.
We have to take a break. Come back. We'll continue the discussion. Stay with us as Pix 11 News Close-Up continues. The criminal justice system in this country costs Americans $80 billion a year. That's twice as much as we spend on education. That is really some statistic. Why should Americans care about reform in prisons?
Because what we have now doesn't line up with our values. We say we believe in second chances, redemption, transformation. What we currently have in place doesn't create opportunities for people to turn their lives around. In fact, one might argue with a recidivism rate of 2/3 within 3 years, the rate of return to prison, that we're actually doing quite the opposite, and we're not achieving the very public safety that we've been shooting for. You mentioned the cost. 3.5 million Americans are employed by our criminal justice system. My older brother was a federal correctional officer for 10 years. He's a U.S. Marshal now. And so we've created a situation where we've monetized misery. So you have one group of Americans that can't find jobs, stable housing, health care, and so we've criminalized those things, and another group of Americans that are now propelled into middle and upper middle class as a result of guarding those very other people. And we just can't continue down this road.
Now, we're talking about recidivism here. Much of that really originates while people are in prison. The care they get there, medical care, education. Jeffrey.
Yeah. I advocate for inmate education, college education, because the recidivism rate is extremely lower for prisoners who've received the college education. Briefly, you're expanding their horizons, you're equipping them for gainful employment, which means their success rate on the outside is much better. In terms of medical care, like in Elmira, where I did 13 and a half to 16 years, it would take an average of 6 weeks to get to a doctor. The quality of care was terrible, and their answer to everything seemed to be just giving over-the-counter medication. I think that we need to upgrade the level of medical care, and people that have debilitating illnesses need to be released from prison to medical facilities on the outside that are equipped to deal with their conditions.
Now, Derek, we hear so much about it. Well, they talk about privatization of prisons and alternatives. Are there any alternatives to incarceration?
Well, we started out with a war on drugs. So when you got 20 years or 30 years, when you got people saying they're having war on drugs, which really is a war on minorities, and you haven't given these drug addicts treatment, you haven't given them a program, you got mothers who are addicted to drugs being taken away from their families, so you destroy the whole family. We have diversionary programs now in place where judges don't even understand their responsibility in sending people out to treatment court to let a judge or a counselor, judge or counsel who's trained and they determine whether the person have an addict, determine should they get that program. You got judges excluding them. No, I'm not giving it to you. It shouldn't be that way. Alternatives to incarceration should be our first approach. If a person is not a threat to public safety, if the person is not a threat to society, they should be given some ankle bracelet. They should be given some other alternative to incarceration to be rehabilitated. Prison is toxic. Prison is very toxic. It's not a place where a mother should be taken away from her child for a minor drug offense.
Glenn, how do you weigh in on that?
You know, you got to have some viewers who are sitting here saying, what about the victims? I think it's important for us to say the most prevalent victim of violent crime in the United States is young black men. And we are having a discussion as a country about racial equity, about policing, where young black men are being held up, in many cases criminalized, in many cases demonized. And what I'm suggesting is this. We have a system that we built at the height of crime, at the height of the crack epidemic, at a time where we didn't know what to do to achieve public safety. Here it is 4.5 decades later. We know what's not working. And so we have to do things differently if we really want public safety. If we care about victims, the right thing to do is to take a look at what we're currently doing and implement policies that help to build people and not destroy communities.
Now, efforts have been made, and right now, before Congress, there are 2 bills that are still pending. They've been sitting there, part of the congressional gridlock. That would help towards the reform of our penal system.
Yeah, you know, we live in a country where we've taught people that tough on crime is the right way to go. And our members of Congress, while there's a lot of rhetoric about turning around this machine that we created, this mass incarceration machine, that very bill, those bills you're referring to are about eliminating mandatory minimum sentences. But those bills have gone to committee and come back with new mandatory minimums within them. So yes, some people would gain their liberty as a result. And so I support the bills, but they're really mediocre compared to the scope of the problem.
Jeffrey, what legislation do you see? What can we do immediately for some remedial action to at least start turning the system around?
I think that everyone who is incarcerated for nonviolent offenses should immediately go in front of like a parole board just for consideration of release. I think we should immediately release all the elderly people in prison. I mean, surely they can be returned back to the streets without compromising public safety.
I think we should start treating people like human beings. I mean, if we treat everybody the way we want to be treated, then we wouldn't be sending our sons and daughters are to prison for minor offenses. We should start by treating everybody the way you want to be treated. Human beings should be treated like human beings.
Let me also say to the folks that are out there watching, if you think about our jails, for instance, here in New York, we have Rikers Island, where there's 8,000 people sitting there on any given day. 81% of them have not been convicted of a crime. They're awaiting trial. So most people are sitting here saying, well, they all did something wrong. Actually, the majority of people in jails all across this country are charged with a crime, and the Constitution doesn't die at the bridge to Rikers. People are innocent until proven guilty, but many of them are there because they're poor and they can't afford even the low bail that's imposed upon them.
Now, the people who think about the victims say you do the crime, do the time. And except in cases where people are wrongfully convicted. There are mandatory sentencing guidelines which the federal judges have, and there's been talk about a minimum mandatory. But that doesn't exist right now, does it?
It doesn't exist right now. At this point, again, we've given the prosecutors a tremendous amount of power. So if I'm facing a mandatory minimum of 25 years, regardless of the circumstances of the case that got me locked up, a prosecutor can now come to me and say, look, I'm going to offer you 15 instead of the 25 you're going to get at trial. What do you think I'm going to do? That's a lot of time that I'm facing. And to undo that, it's not like there's one law we need to pass or one policy lever to trip. We got here through a million cuts, and we're going to get out of here through a million Band-Aids. It's going to take us a while.
I just want to add really quickly that it's great to get legislation passed. I completely support that idea. But some of the things that I was talking about, like elderly people in prison and nonviolent offenders, we don't need to pass a law for that. The governor could give clemency, the same way that President Obama did.
One of the things the governor said when he first became governor of New York, he said New York State must change the way they do business, and they must find another way to get job security for people. I mean, this is about job security. The most of the legislators represent people who want prisons, their jobs for their families, upstate New York. They don't have an interest in closing prisons. So we need to find jobs for these people so that it don't be on our backs, on our sweat and our tears.
Now, Governor Cuomo, it has to be set out he wants to close down some of the prisons in New York State. Reduce the prison population. New York has become a model for the rest of the country.
New York is proving something to the country that people are having a hard time wrapping their heads around. We actually have less people in prison. We've reduced our prison population by 27% in the last 20 years. We've reduced our jail population here in New York City by over 50% in the last 20 years. And crime is down, serious crime is down to levels of 1961. So here you can actually have less people locked up and more public safety, which is the antithesis of what we've been telling each other for so long, that you have to lock up more people to achieve safety.
But on the other hand, I also want to point out that New York, we're amongst the worst in the country when it comes to wrongful conviction. We have like the third highest wrongful conviction rate, and despite Governor Cuomo in his State of the State address a couple years ago referencing the need to videotape interrogations and better ID reform, nothing's happened with those bills, and frankly, I don't see him out on the stump speaking about these ideas, exercising the bully pulpit that he has from his position. He needs to be more vocal and throw his political weight behind those reforms if he's serious about doing it.
Going in this direction, do you think you'll get a better treatment under President Trump? He has already, he's named Jeffrey Sessions as, nominated Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, who already is opposed to the minimum mandatory.
Yeah, Jeff Sessions articulates that we need to do something about mass incarceration and all the punishment that stems from it, and at the same time continues to support mandatory minimums. We're not going to get to the finish line without addressing mandatory minimums.
I think there's a possibility we could see some reforms under President Trump because, number one, I think if the right expert is in his ear, that I think there's a possibility he'll implement things, some changes. But most importantly, Marvin, is that Donald Trump's a businessman, and a lot of the issues we're talking about can be framed in terms of real economic savings. And so if we phrase things in that way, I think there's a possibility some changes might come about.
I think Trump is for privatization of prisons. I think that you may even see more prisons being built under Trump because he's talking about locking immigrants up and sending them out of the country. They have to be detained somewhere before they're deported.
Well, all very enlightening. It's a subject we're going to hear a lot more about, and we'll see what happens under a new administration. But there definitely, as you point out, there is a need for some reform of the criminal justice system. So our thanks to our guests, Jeffrey Deskovic, Glenn Martin, and Derek Hamilton for your insight, and hopefully it'll lead to some positive changes in the prison system. We're going to take a break. When we come back, the city has a new memorial to remember those who died from AIDS. Mary Murphy will take a look back at the ravages of the epidemic. We'll be right back. AIDS was the scourge of the 80s that claimed millions of lives worldwide. The Centers for Disease Control says that more than 1 million people in the U.S. are currently infected with HIV. That's the virus that causes AIDS. There is no cure, but drugs can control symptoms and help stop its spread. The positive news here in New York is that the number of new cases diagnosed in the city last year fell below 2,500. That's the first time that has happened in the history of the epidemic. Now, that news comes as the city dedicated a memorial to the more than 100,000 men, women, and children who lost their lives to AIDS. Mary Murphy takes a look back.
I wasn't alive yet. I was born in November of 1981. I was really shocked by the fact that I knew so little about the history, and being a gay man in New York City, we found that ignorance in our generation was really quite broad.
35-year-old Chris Tepper was born just a few months after the New York Times featured its first 1981 headline about a rare cancer seen in 41 homosexuals.
A new and bewildering disease called AIDS has killed more than 400 people.
Pix 11 did one of the first news series in New York City when the illness finally had a name: acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Singer Michael Callan received his diagnosis in 1982.
I am consistently sick.
35 years later, the death toll from AIDS is up to 35 million globally, transmitted through blood or sex or to babies in utero. AIDS took the life of music star Freddie Mercury 6 years after one-time Hollywood hunk Rock Hudson succumbed to it. It decimated the lives of many in New York's fashion and art worlds. Tainted blood reportedly infected tennis star Arthur Ashe during heart surgery. Ryan White, a young hemophiliac, inspired the world with his courageous battle against AIDS bullying. This is just a tiny piece of the history behind the New York City AIDS Memorial, a steel and granite structure dedicated not just to those lost, but to the activists and caregivers who demanded government action.
Celebrate the heroes from our community who were generals in a war.
One of those generals was Larry Kramer, who wrote the critically acclaimed play The Normal Heart, which later became a movie.
Mr. Mayor, we need your help! Mr. Mayor!
Kramer was the force behind Act Up, which famously interrupted Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in 1989 when John Cardinal O'Connor was on the altar. Activists upset with the Cardinal's opposition to condom distribution chained themselves to pews, and some were taken out on stretchers.
Look up.
One of the other defining works about AIDS in New York was Tony Kushner's Angels in America, which won a Pulitzer Prize for drama and later became a film starring Al Pacino as powerhouse New York lawyer Roy Cohn.
AIDS is what homosexuals have. I have liver cancer.
The old St. Vincent's Hospital has been converted into condos, but there's a good reason why the New York City AIDS Memorial sits in its shadow. St. Vincent's was considered ground zero during the AIDS crisis, where so many of the stricken came to be treated or to die.
It was the first and largest AIDS ward in the city. In New York City alone, over 100,000 men, women, and children have died from AIDS.
And while amazing strides in treatment have turned AIDS from a death sentence to more of a chronic medical condition in the States, it's still ravaging many countries in Africa.
We haven't been able to reduce the number of new infections.
Nearly 37 million people worldwide living with HIV/AIDS. Michael Callan lost his battle in 1994. Not long after he performed at the March on Washington.
What we don't have is time.
Our thanks to Mary Murphy for that excellent report. And along with the news that fewer people in the city were diagnosed with HIV, comes the report that not one baby was born with the HIV infection in the city last year. And that certainly is a positive note. That'll do it for our broadcast for this week. If you have any comments or wish to see the broadcast again, log on to our website, pix11.com/newscloseup. I'm Marvin Scott. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, everyone.